if I told you that the greatest maritime power in history was terrified of water? Rome, whose legions were unmatched on land, viewed the sea as a foreign and hostile element. Their world was one of dusty roads, sturdy forts, and iron discipline of the infantry. The sea belonged to others, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, and their descendants, the Carthaginians. For them, the waves were home, and ships were an extension of their bodies. But history presented Rome with an ultimatum. Either conquer the sea, or the sea and your enemies will consume you. This is the story of how a nation of land farmers and soldiers who did not know how to build warships and did not know the tactics of naval combat was forced to become the masters of the seas. They did not just learn, they rewrote the rules, turning naval battles into land battles on floating platforms. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how one ingenious and crude mechanism, invented out of desperation, allowed the Romans to turn their main disadvantage into a decisive advantage. What if I told you that absolutely everything you believed about the legendary Roman military power and dominance is incomplete and misses a critical aspect? We habitually imagine majestic Rome as a colossal maritime empire whose unshakable power extended unhindered across the vast Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. But at the very beginning of their historical development, the Romans were exclusively a land-based agrarian power of peasants, with a deeply rooted mentality of cautious farmers and tillers of the soil, rather than brave sailors and navigators. The sea was a foreign and hostile element for a people who grew up among hills and fields, not on the ocean shore. For the typical early Roman of the 3rd century BC, the endless sea was an ominous source of irrational fear and numerous superstitions, rather than an enticing opportunity for trade and conquest. It was a completely unpredictable, deadly element, populated in their primitive imagination by terrifying mythical monsters such as Scylla and Charybdis. Their entire traditional economy, conservative culture, and proven military doctrine were firmly and inextricably tied to the solid ground beneath their feet. Romans felt confident only on land, where they could set up camp and fight in formation, while the sea deprived them of this grounding in both the literal and figurative sense. They methodically built the best straight roads in the known world out of stone, rather than fast ships with sails. Their real military strength lay in the unique ability of a disciplined legion to advance methodically and relentlessly on land, build fortified camps overnight, and mercilessly crush any enemy in a tight formation of spears. Water, however, completely deprived them of all these hard-won tactical advantages, rendering them useless. On a swaying deck, it was impossible to build a phalanx or dig a trench. Everything that Roman soldiers had been taught since childhood lost its meaning in naval combat, where different laws of physics and tactics ruled. Their first primitive ships were extremely few in number and clumsy, designed exclusively for cautious coastal navigation along the shore and small-scale trade along the coast of their native Italy, without straying far from land. The Romans categorically lacked both centuries of accumulated seafaring experience and advanced shipbuilding technologies for the construction of real large military fleets consisting of hundreds of ships. They looked with fear and envy at the great recognized maritime powers of their time: Carthage, Rhodes, Athens. As a peasant looks at the unattainable stars, not understanding how it is possible to live on the water. Mighty Carthage, the direct heir to the ancient Phoenician seafaring traditions of millennia, ruled the Western Mediterranean unchallenged and confidently as the undisputed master. Their huge fleet of hundreds of fast ships was incredibly swift and maneuverable, manned by experienced professional crews who knew every wind and current. For the Carthaginians, naval combat was a high art of warfare based on lightning-fast maneuvers, precise trajectory calculations, and crushing ramming of the enemy ship's bow. Their triremes were the perfect weapon of their era, honed by centuries of evolution. The inexperienced Romans, however, were categorically unable to fight so masterfully on the water according to the enemy's rules. Their few unwieldy ships were clumsy copies of foreign models, and their rookie sailors were completely inexperienced in maritime affairs and suffered from seasickness. Any attempt to boldly challenge Carthage's dominance in its native element seemed like obvious suicide and madness to everyone. The Carthaginians would have destroyed the Roman fleet in a matter of hours, using their overwhelming advantage in experience and maneuverability against the unwieldy Roman ships. This fundamental, irrational fear of the sea and complete inability to effectively conduct military affairs on water were the main strategic vulnerability of the rapidly growing Rome of the 3rd century BC. They could successfully control the entire Apennine Peninsula on land with the force of their legions, but were effectively locked into their peninsula by invisible chains. The sea was an insurmountable barrier and prison wall, rather than a convenient bridge to new and tempting conquests and riches. Each wave was a reminder of the limits of Roman power and ambition. The far-sighted Romans understood keenly from bitter experience that until they radically solved this critical problem of maritime supremacy, their territorial growth and influence would be severely limited to the land. Any enemy with a strong navy could ravage their defenseless coastline with raids with complete impunity and completely block their vital maritime grain trade. This was a humiliating position of weakness that the proud and extremely ambitious Roman people could not psychologically accept for long without losing their self-respect. The fear of the sea had to be overcome. Otherwise, Rome would remain forever a regional land power with no future. It was this painful awareness of their own critical weakness at sea that became a powerful impetus for the greatest unprecedented military transformation and innovation in ancient history. Rome had to go out into the open sea and conquer it in order to simply survive as a power and defeat Carthage in the coming war. And to achieve this incredible goal, they had to completely and radically rethink the very concept of naval warfare from scratch, discarding tradition. The impossible had to become possible through the power of Roman will and engineering. The Romans were pragmatists and realists to the core, and they understood from experience that simply blindly copying the tactics and technologies of the enemy would not mechanically lead to guaranteed success and victory over the masters. It would be very interesting to hear your balanced opinion on this strategic question. What do you think is objectively more important and effective for achieving victory over a superior enemy? Completely adopting the enemy's proven tactics and methods, or boldly inventing your own revolutionary and unique strategy that leverages your strengths? Please write your reasoned opinion on this in detail in the comments below, sharing examples. Are you ready to learn the truth about how one conflict changed the course of history forever? It all began in Sicily, a rich and strategically important island that became a bone of contention between Rome and Carthage. This conflict, which went down in history as the First Punic War, was the catalyst that pushed Rome into the sea. Initially, the war was fought on land, on the territory of Sicily. Here, the Roman legions felt confident. They methodically pushed back the Carthaginian garrisons, capturing one city after another. However, the Romans soon faced an insurmountable problem. Carthage, controlling the sea, was able to freely supply its fortresses on the island. They brought in reinforcements, food and weapons, making any siege long and exhausting. Moreover, the Carthaginian fleet made constant raids on the coast of Italy. They ravaged coastal towns and villages, distracting Roman forces and undermining the economy. The Roman army was powerless to counter this. Roman commanders quickly realized a simple truth. It was impossible to win the war for Sicily without controlling the sea lanes leading to it. Victory on land was meaningless as long as the enemy dominated the water. The Senate faced a fateful choice. Either admit defeat and give up Sicily, or do the impossible. Build from scratch a fleet capable of challenging the greatest maritime power of the time. For pragmatic and stubborn Rome, the answer was obvious. This decision was unprecedented in its boldness and scale. Rome had no blueprints for warships, no experienced engineers, and, most importantly, no trained crews. They had to learn from scratch and in the midst of a war. They understood that they would not be able to surpass the Carthaginians in their traditional tactics based on maneuvering and ramming. This art had been learned over generations. The Romans needed to find an asymmetrical response that would negate all of the enemy's advantages. It was at this moment of desperation and necessity that the Roman naval doctrine was born. It was based not on an attempt to become the best sailors, but on transferring to the sea what they were best at on land. It was the concept of naval boarding combat. But to implement this concept, they needed ships that could not only catch up with the enemy, but also withstand close combat. But how do you build such a ship if you've never done it before? In the next chapter, you'll learn what incredible gift of fate helped the Romans steal their enemy's main secret. What I am about to show you was a real miracle for the Romans. At the very beginning of the war, when the Romans first realized the need for a fleet, fate presented them with a truly royal gift. During one of the naval skirmishes off the coast of Italy, a Carthaginian Pantera, or Quinquereme, the flagship of the time, was caught in a storm and washed ashore. For the Romans, this was not just military booty, it was the key to the future. The ship was practically undamaged, and now they had in their hands a real example of Carthage's advanced naval technology. They had obtained not just a trophy, but a detailed blueprint created by their enemies. This captured ship immediately became the subject of the most intense study. The best Roman engineers and carpenters were gathered to take it apart, literally board by board. They measured every element and studied every knot and joint. They sought to understand not only the design, but also the philosophy behind it. They analyzed the shape of the hull, the arrangement of the oars, and the design of the masts and sails. All this was done in order to understand how the Carthaginians achieved such speed and maneuverability. The Romans were brilliant engineers, and they quickly grasped the basic principles. They did not blindly copy every detail. Instead, they adapted the design to their own needs, and more importantly, to their manufacturing capabilities. While the engineers were studying the trophy, orders were given throughout Italy to begin building a fleet in its image and likeness. It was a task of colossal proportions. Hundreds of thousands of trees had to be felled and processed, shipyards had to be prepared, and thousands of workers had to be assembled. The Romans applied their signature approach to shipbuilding, standardization, and mass production. They created a system in which individual parts of the ship, frames, keel, planking, were manufactured to uniform standards. This allowed ships to be assembled like a construction set, significantly speeding up the process. Legend has it that while the ships were being built, the future crews had already begun training, but we'll talk about that later. The main thing is that the capture of a single enemy ship allowed Rome to reduce its technological gap, which under normal circumstances would have taken decades to overcome. It was a turning point. Instead of trying to build their own ship through trial and error, the Romans got a ready-made and proven solution. They essentially stole the technology from their enemy and turned it against them. This episode perfectly illustrates the Roman approach to innovation. They rarely invented anything completely new, but they were geniuses at borrowing, adapting, and improving on other people's ideas, bringing them to practical perfection. Guess how long it took to build this? Once they had the blueprints, Rome faced a new, even more ambitious task: turning this knowledge into an actual fleet. This required mobilizing all the resources of the Republic and demonstrated the unique organizational skills of the Romans. A massive construction project began. The first and most important resource was wood. A huge amount of high-quality timber was needed to build more than 100 quinqueremes and triremes. Special teams were sent throughout Italy to select and cut down suitable trees, pines and firs for the hull, oaks for the keel and frames. The felled trees had to be transported to the coast, where shipyards were being built in a hurry. The Romans used their excellent road network and river routes for transportation. It was a complex logistical operation that required precise planning. Work was in full swing at the shipyards. The Romans organized the process according to the conveyor belt principle. Some workers were engaged in the manufacture of keels, others in frames, and still others in planking. This specialization significantly accelerated construction. They did not have centuries of shipbuilding experience like their opponents. Therefore, they relied on precise calculations, standardization, and strict quality control. Each element was manufactured according to a single model, which ensured interchangeability and speed of assembly. Sources report an incredible fact. The first Roman fleet of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes was built in just 2 months. This figure seems fantastic, but it reflects a colossal concentration of effort and resources. The entire Republic worked to create its fleet. Parallel to the construction of the hulls, work was underway to manufacture all the necessary equipment. Thousands of oars, hundreds of masts, kilometers of rope, and square meters of sailcloth were all produced in huge quantities. It was a true industrial revolution in the ancient world. The Romans also made their own changes to the ship's design. They made it slightly heavier and stronger than the Carthaginian prototype. Their goal was not maximum speed, but stability and the ability to withstand boarding combat. This titanic effort demonstrated Rome's main advantage. Their ability to organize and mobilize was unmatched. They could turn an entire country into a single military camp, working toward a single goal. When the first ships were launched, it was a sight to behold. Just yesterday, Rome had no fleet, and today a formidable armada stood in the roadstead. But ships are just empty hulls. What do you do if you don't have people who can sail them? In the next chapter, you'll learn how the Romans learned to row without ever going to sea. Now that Rome had ships, the most difficult problem arose: crews. There were practically no experienced sailors in the Republic, and to operate a single quinquereme required about 300 rowers, whose actions had to be brought to absolute automatism. The Carthaginians had honed their skills over generations. Their rowers were professionals, capable of performing the most complex maneuvers on command. The Romans, on the other hand, had to create such crews from scratch and in the shortest possible time. Here they applied another ingenious and unorthodox solution. Realizing that training directly on the water would be long and dangerous, they moved the training to land. Special training camps were built along the entire coast. In these camps, wooden platforms were erected, exactly imitating the decks and rowers' benches on a real ship. The future crews sat on these structures just as they would have sat on a quinquereme. They held real oars in their hands. The commands were given by a special officer who set the rhythm with a hammer or flute. The recruits, many of whom had never seen the sea in their lives, learned the most important thing: synchronization. They practiced a unified stroke, turning and braking. These training sessions were exhausting. Day after day, from dawn to dusk, thousands of people sat on wooden benches and monotonously swung their oars. They honed their movements to muscle memory so that they could act without thinking in battle. This approach solved several problems at once. First, it was completely safe. There was no risk of losing ships or people due to inept actions. Second, it allowed a large number of rowers to be trained at the same time while the ships were still being built. When the fleet was ready, the partially trained crews boarded the ships. All they had to do was apply the skills they had mastered on land to the water. Of course, they lacked real sea experience, but the foundations had already been laid. This episode of land-based training became legendary. It demonstrates the pragmatism of the Romans and their ability to find simple and effective solutions to the most complex problems. They could not compete with the enemy in experience, so they relied on discipline and drill. As a result, when the Roman fleet first set sail, it was manned by crews who may not have been skilled sailors, but knew how to do the most important thing. They knew how to row in unison and with power on command, and for the new Roman tactics, that was quite enough. The Romans understood perfectly well that even with new ships and trained rowers, they would not be able to defeat the Carthaginians in a maneuverable battle. Ram tactics required precision skills that they did not have. They needed to come up with a way to impose their own style of combat on the enemy. It was then that an anonymous Roman engineer created a device that turned the tide of war. It was simple, crude, but devilishly effective. It went down in history as the Corvus, or Crow. The Raven was a heavy boarding bridge, about 11 meters long and just over a meter wide. It was mounted on the bow of a Roman ship and could rotate freely around a vertical mast. This allowed it to be aimed in any direction. A massive, sharp iron spike, resembling a raven's beak, was attached to the underside of the bridge at its far end. It was this spike that gave the device its name. This spike was the main element of the design. The principle of operation was ingenious in its simplicity. A Roman ship approached an enemy vessel. When the distance was reduced to a minimum, the Crow, held in a vertical position by a rope, dropped sharply onto the enemy's deck. Under its own weight, the bridge fell down, and its sharp spike pierced the boards of the enemy deck with force. The ships were firmly locked together. The Carthaginian captain lost the most important thing: freedom of maneuver. And at that moment, the part of the battle began in which the Romans were unmatched. Legionnaires rushed onto the enemy's deck via the boarding bridge. The naval battle instantly turned into a land battle. The Romans brought to the sea what they knew best, fighting in close formation, wielding swords and shields. The Carthaginian crews, consisting mainly of rowers and a small number of marines, were not prepared for this. They could not withstand the disciplined and well-armed Roman infantry on their own deck. The Corvus completely changed the rules of the game. It nullified all the Carthaginians' advantages in speed and maneuverability. Now the outcome of the battle was decided not by skillful maneuvering, but by the strength and training of the boarding party. This invention was the embodiment of Roman military genius. They did not try to surpass the enemy in their strengths. Instead, they created an asymmetrical weapon that allowed them to use their own strengths. But did this simple and ingenious device work in the conditions of a real naval battle? In the next chapter, you will learn how the Raven underwent its first baptism of fire. The first serious test for the new Roman fleet and its secret weapon was the Battle of Melas in 260 BC. The Roman armada, commanded by Consul Gaius Duilius, encountered the experienced Carthaginian fleet. The Carthaginians were absolutely confident of victory. They saw before them clumsy Roman ships equipped with strange and cumbersome structures on their bows. Not understanding their purpose, they rushed into battle, intending to easily deal with the upstarts. This was their fatal mistake. As soon as the Carthaginian ships came close enough for a ramming attack, the crows crashed onto their decks with a bang. Sharp spikes pierced the hull, firmly locking the ships together. The Carthaginian captains realized with horror that they had fallen into a trap. Roman legionnaires poured across the boarding bridges. The battle immediately turned into a series of fierce hand-to-hand combat on the decks. Here, all the advantages were on the Roman side, and they ruthlessly exploited them. The outcome of the battle was stunning. Rome, which had not had a single major naval victory before, completely destroyed the Carthaginian fleet. It was a triumph of new tactics and new weapons. But the real apogee of Roman naval power came with the Battle of Cape Ecnomus in 256 BC. It was one of the largest naval battles in ancient history. Nearly 700 ships and about 300,000 men took part on both sides. The Romans again relied on the Corvus and boarding tactics. They arranged their huge fleet in a unique wedge formation, which was difficult to encircle and attack from the flanks. The Carthaginians tried to use their superior maneuverability, but again and again, their ships fell into the steel embrace of the crow. The battle turned into a grand slaughter, where the outcome was decided not by maneuvering, but by the steadfastness and discipline of the infantry. Once again, the Roman legionaries proved their superiority. Rome's victory was complete and unconditional, opening the way for them to invade Africa. These two battles completely changed the balance of power at sea. The Romans proved that their innovative approach worked. They did not become the best sailors, but they became the best fighters at sea. The success of the Corvus was so great that it became the hallmark of the Roman fleet for a long time. This simple device allowed Rome to transform itself from a land power into a maritime power in a very short time. It was the key to their first great victory over Carthage. Despite the initial resounding success and revolutionary nature of the invention, the Romans eventually consciously abandoned the use of the famous Corvus. This ingenious device was extremely heavy and cumbersome in design, critically shifting the center of gravity of the entire ship dangerously upward, toward the mast and deck. In heavy storms with high waves, ships equipped with a heavy crow on the bow were extremely unstable on the water and often capsized catastrophically, sinking their crews. The innovation that saved Rome in war became its curse in peacetime on the rough seas. After several maritime disasters and tragedies, when entire fleets of dozens of ships were lost en masse, not at the hands of enemy sailors in battle, but due to unpredictable bad weather and storms, the pragmatic Romans finally understood and acknowledged that the Corvus had been extremely useful in the early stages of conquering the sea against Carthage, but had now become a dangerous burden and weakness. By that historic time in the middle of the 3rd century BC, they had already gained sufficient practical experience in the complex business of seafaring and shipbuilding. Their legionary sailors and ship captains had become much more skilled and experienced professionals of the sea who did not need crutches such as boarding bridges to defeat the enemy. Roman shipbuilding and shipbuilding technologies also did not stand still, but actively developed. They began to ambitiously build increasingly larger and more powerful warships of a new generation, real floating, impregnable fortresses made of wood and bronze. Impressive decarums and hexers appeared, giant ships with 10 and 6 rows of oarsmen, respectively, which significantly surpassed in size, displacement, and combat power anything that experienced Carthaginian shipbuilders had ever built. It was a naval arms race in which Rome demonstrated its unlimited resources and ability to mobilize tens of thousands of workers to build its fleet. The wide decks of these maritime giants were strategically equipped with tall wooden battle towers with embrasures rising above the deck. From their height, professional archers and experienced javelin throwers could methodically shower enemy ships with a continuous hail of deadly projectiles from a safe distance. This innovation made it possible to inflict significant damage on the crew and demoralize the enemy even before the decisive boarding combat began, which gave a psychological advantage. The enemy was already weakened and frightened when the boarding began. Moreover, inventive Roman engineers began to actively and extensively use powerful throwing machines borrowed from land tactics on warships. Light ballistas and scorpions, torsion catapults successfully borrowed from siege warfare against cities, were securely installed on the fortified decks of large ships. They could accurately throw heavy metal arrows and stone balls over a considerable distance of hundreds of meters, piercing the sides of enemy ships and killing rowers. This was a revolutionary application of land weapons at sea, giving the Romans a firepower advantage. Now the evolved Roman fleet could effectively conduct complex multi-level combat at any advantageous distance chosen by the commander. At long range, beyond the reach of the ram, they actively used destructive throwing machines to damage enemy ships. At medium range, they used numerous experienced archers and professional javelin throwers to defeat enemy forces. And in close combat, they still relied confidently on tried and tested boarding techniques and the superiority of legionnaires in hand-to-hand combat, but without the help of the cumbersome, outdated crow, which had become unnecessary. Flexibility of tactics was the key to dominance at sea. Roman naval tactics also became significantly more complex and refined with experience. Roman admirals commanding the fleet learned to masterfully use various tactical formations of ships, skillfully maneuver squadrons, and clearly coordinate the complex actions of large naval formations consisting of hundreds of ships. They creatively adopted the best proven elements of centuries-old naval tactics and strategy from the Greeks and Carthaginians, but organically added their own unique tactics based on Roman power and the iron discipline of the legions. This synthesis of traditions created an invincible force at sea. Ships gradually became more specialized and diverse in their purpose. In addition to heavy, unwieldy ships of the line for general battles, light, fast liburns, maneuverable ships with 2 rows of oars, were actively built. They were specifically used for maritime reconnaissance and patrols, patrolling trade routes and vigorously pursuing sea pirates in narrow straits. Specialization increased the effectiveness of the fleet in different situations. The Roman Navy evolved and transformed from a primitive, simple tool for boarding enemy ships into a complex, multifunctional, and flexible military machine with a multitude of capabilities. It was now fully capable of successfully accomplishing a wide variety of strategic tasks, from large-scale naval battles to prolonged blockades of enemy ports and systematic combating of piracy on trade routes. Rome finally and irrevocably became the undisputed master of all the seas of the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, our sea. No one challenged Roman dominance on the water anymore, and this dominance would last for centuries. This impressive evolution clearly shows everyone that the far-sighted Romans never rested complacently on their laurels and victories. They constantly and tirelessly learned from their mistakes, flexibly adapted to new challenges, and methodically improved their military technology, weapons, and combat tactics. It was this unique ability to continuously develop, learn, and innovate that made them virtually invincible on both land and sea for centuries. Victory over Carthage and other rivals gave Rome complete control of the Mediterranean Sea. They began to call it Mare Nostrum, which translates from Latin as our sea. It was not just a beautiful name, but a reflection of geopolitical reality. For the first time in history, the entire Mediterranean basin was under the control of a single power. The Roman fleet was no longer needed to wage major wars against an equal opponent. Its main task became maintaining order and ensuring the security of maritime communications. One of the most important functions of the fleet was to protect trade routes. The sea was the main transport artery of the empire. Goods, raw materials, building materials, and, most importantly, grain were transported along it. The supply of Rome itself and its huge armies depended entirely on grain shipments from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Huge transport ships, the so-called grain fleets, constantly plied these routes. Military ships accompanied them, protecting them from any threats. The Roman fleet ensured the rapid transfer of legions to any point in the empire. In the event of a rebellion in one of the provinces or a threat on the border, troops could be quickly delivered by sea to where they were needed. This gave the Roman military machine incredible mobility. Ports throughout the Mediterranean were expanded and fortified. Lighthouses, piers, and warehouses were built. Rome created an extensive naval infrastructure that supported the activities of the fleet and trade. Roman engineers learned to build artificial harbors in places where there were no natural bays. They developed waterproof concrete that allowed them to erect massive structures directly in the sea. The port at Ostia, Rome's sea gate, was an engineering marvel of its time. Control of the sea was the basis of the Roman Empire's economic prosperity and political stability. It connected scattered provinces and facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. The sea ceased to be a barrier and became the main unifying factor. The peace and order established at sea by the Roman fleet was called Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For several centuries, the Mediterranean Sea was a zone of free and safe trade, which contributed to unprecedented economic growth. The Roman fleet was the guarantor of this prosperity. Thus, the invention of naval warfare for Rome resulted in more than just military victories. It became the foundation on which the entire economic and logistical system of their vast empire was built. Control of the sea was synonymous with control of the world. In the late turbulent period of the dying republic, shortly before the establishment of the absolute power of the empire, the entire Mediterranean Sea faced a serious and growing threat. Mass organized piracy on an unprecedented scale. Numerous pirates, based mainly in mountainous Cilicia in southern Asia Minor and wild Illyria on the Adriatic, aggressively formed powerful fleets of dozens of fast ships. They mercilessly plundered defenseless merchant ships, brazenly attacked wealthy coastal cities, and captured thousands of people, including Roman citizens, for ransom or to be sold into slavery in the markets. It was true maritime anarchy, undermining the economy and prestige of Rome, which was unable to protect its citizens on its own sea. The problem of lawlessness reached such catastrophic proportions and threatening proportions that brazen pirates began to openly threaten vital grain supplies from Egypt and Sicily to crowded Rome, threatening famine and riots. They acted with incredible audacity, arrogance, and virtually complete impunity for years, mocking a powerless Rome. Their numerous fortified bases and lairs were strategically scattered along the vast Mediterranean coastline, in inaccessible sheltered bays and impregnable mountain gorges, where Roman ships were afraid to venture. The pirates felt like masters of the sea, and Rome suffered humiliation. The concerned Roman Senate finally understood and acknowledged that timid half measures and isolated punitive expeditions would never solve this systemic problem at its root. An unprecedented, large-scale, and decisive military operation was needed to clear the entire sea at once. In 67 BC, this critically important task of national significance was officially entrusted to one of the most talented and successful commanders of the time, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, who had already become famous for his victories on land. He was a man capable of thinking strategically and acting decisively without hesitation. Pompey was granted absolutely unprecedented, extraordinary powers, which no Roman commander had ever had before in the history of the Republic. He was given sole command of a huge fleet of 500 warships of all types, a land army of 120,000 elite legionaries, and virtually unlimited financial resources from the state treasury for the operation. His dictatorial power and imperium extended to the entire Mediterranean Sea without exception, and to a significant strip 75 kilometers deep into the coastal territory for the pursuit of enemies. It was a power almost equal to that of an emperor, which caused concern among conservative senators who feared dictatorship. The brilliant Pompey approached this complex task methodically, with characteristic Roman methodicalness, planning, and an ingenious, innovative strategy of coverage. He wisely refrained from senselessly chasing individual fast pirate ships across the sea, as his predecessors had done. Instead, he revolutionarily divided the entire vast Mediterranean Sea into 13 manageable sectors of responsibility, each of which was personally supervised by one of his trusted legates commanders with his own designated squadron and troops. It was decentralized management with centralized planning, a revolutionary idea for its time. The operation itself was carried out with lightning speed and perfectly coordinated according to a single plan from the center. In all 13 sectors, Roman military fleets simultaneously launched an attack according to a predetermined schedule. They moved methodically from west to east, like a huge untowable fishing net, systematically driving the pirates into a trap at their main base in mountainous Cilicia. It was a model of strategic planning and coordination of the actions of huge forces across a space of thousands of kilometers. The cornered pirates were completely deprived of the opportunity to maneuver freely, escape to the open sea, and hide in other familiar regions of the Mediterranean. The omnipresent Roman fleet tightly blocked absolutely all exits from the sectors and methodically and systematically combed every island, every bay, and every hiding place in search of enemies. The Romans mercilessly destroyed the pirates' fortified bases and hideouts one by one with fire and sword, and the captured ships were burned on the shore. The circle was closing inexorably, and the pirates had nowhere to flee from retribution. The final bloody stage of the operation unfolded off the rocky shores of Cilicia, the pirates' last refuge. Here, the triumphant Pompey gathered his main strike forces of the fleet and dealt a crushing final defeat to the cornered pirates in a decisive large-scale naval battle at Cora. After this victory, he immediately landed a massive force of legionnaires on the shore and systematically captured their last mountain fortresses on land by storm, giving the enemy no respite. Resistance was broken completely and forever. The entire grandiose operation to completely rid the Mediterranean Sea of the threat of piracy, which numbered in the thousands, took the organized Pompey only 3 months of active operations from start to finish. It was an absolutely brilliant demonstration of the indestructible power, efficiency, and organizational talent of the Roman fleet and command of the whole world. Pompey convincingly proved to skeptics that the Roman fleet was capable not only of winning major battles against regular fleets, but also of successfully conducting complex, multi-level police operations on a planetary scale across vast areas. This required not only strength, but also unprecedented coordination and logistics. Pompey's impressive victory over the pirates ensured the safety of navigation and trade throughout the Mediterranean Sea for merchants for many decades to come. It was the final triumph of organized Roman state power and order over the primitive chaos and anarchy of barbarism at sea. The Roman Navy finally and irrevocably confirmed its undisputed status as the supreme guardian of order and law on the Mare Nostrum. Our sea, as the Romans proudly called the Mediterranean, considering it the empire's inland lake. We have traced the amazing journey of the Roman fleet, from fear of water to complete domination of the seas. This story is not just a tale of ships and battles. It is a story of how unyielding will, organizational genius, and the ability to think outside the box can overcome any obstacle. The Romans were not born sailors, but they became sailors out of necessity. They did not copy their enemies, but invented their own rules of the game, turning the sea into an arena for their legions. The invention of the corvus, a system of land-based training, and the mass production of ships were all links in a chain forged by Roman pragmatism. Ultimately, conquering the sea became the key to Rome's creation of a great empire. The fleet tied together vast territories, ensured economic prosperity, and allowed order to be maintained for centuries. The history of the Roman fleet is a striking example of how a nation, faced with a deadly challenge, not only survives but becomes stronger, forever changing itself and the whole world. What other topics from military history or ancient engineering achievements would you like to see on our channel? Share your ideas in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.